The, uh, the panelists that I have the great honor to moderate today, as David mentioned, are truly living legends. And in having the opportunity to do some of the pre-conversation in planning for this panel, I was just struck by the depth and degree of history that they have seen with their own eyes and that they can share with us directly. But also their direct and present relevance in the conversation that we're having today. We are in a particularly challenging time, obviously, for news media, for our civics, if you will, in general. The role of the news has been questioned and challenged. News people have been attacked, sometimes viciously, sometimes physically, and certainly verbally. The very relationship between audiences, newsmakers, and news people is being derogated on an ongoing and daily basis. And yet, none of this is new to our panelists. None of this is new to many of us in this room. We have seen what it's like when the news has been co-opted. We've seen what happens when we are not part of conversations. We have seen what's happened when news people are not representative of the audiences that they're speaking to. I'm going to begin by just noting that the springboard for this conversation is, of course, the Kerner Commission report. Congresswoman Demings mentioned this in her opening remarks. It is a landmark report that was issued in the wake of a wide array of urban violence in the 1960s. LBJ, who was the president at the time, received the report and promptly chose to more or less disregard it. This was a report that covered a wide array of recommendations. These were recommendations that would enhance the way that people of color, African Americans in particular, would be included in society, given a more level playing field, an opportunity to address some of the underlying problems that led to the tensions that fueled the riots, that fueled the uprising, right? Instead, because there were other more pressing issues perhaps in his agenda, he chose to not pursue them. And in particular, the deeper cuts, if you will, from that album, the role of the media and how inclusion in the media would in fact alter the flight path of our culture, those were recommendations that were not made. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists, Dorothy and Helen. I'm going to just simply say that, again, they're iconic individuals, and ask them actually to tell a little bit about themselves, beginning with Dorothy, because your career begins, to a certain extent, in the moments prior to the Kerner Commission, and then continues to this day. But you were a witness to some of the things that occurred that led to the report, and then ultimately, as the first black woman at the Washington Post, you were essentially party to both covering the aftermath and living the consequences, if you will, as a journalist. Dorothy, please share with us a little bit of your history. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's just a pleasure to be here, and thanks again to the sponsors, to the Congresswoman, and to all of you who are looking at this very, very important subject and who are bringing it to new light and new insight into the subject. Yes, it's true that I was the first black woman reporter at the Washington Post. I arrived at the Post in October of 1961, and it was a very segregated Washington, D.C., and also obviously a very segregated newspaper. There were 2 African-American males who were already there. It was a challenging time because once again, to be the first is not easy, and especially in a segregated city. Humiliations such as being mistaken for a maid when I went to cover an assignment. Challenges such as getting taxi cabs to go and cover my assignments. Challenges such as having fellow employees who might be somewhat civil inside the newspaper, but who would pretend they didn't know me if they saw me in the street. These were things that we just had to endure and keep moving past, because we knew that the truth was the nation needed diversity in the media. And just as the Congresswoman talked about Martin Luther King telling this other wonderful person that she couldn't leave, I also heard Martin Luther King say to me, not personally, but to young people like me, that it is so important that you go into these white institutions and stay and excel. And so I knew what was going on with so many other people who looked like me, who were the first and who were determined to stay. The Kerner Commission was extraordinarily important because it came in the wake of the urban rebellions of the 1960s. And one of the things that newspapers found at that point was that they didn't have reporters who could go out into the black neighborhoods and cover the story. They would send them into the neighborhoods and the people would run them out because the white media had paid no attention to the black and people of color, but at this point primarily it was black and white. The only time they had written about in any kind of detail about what was going on was with the civil rights movement and with the 1954 decision outlawing school segregation. So it was very, very crucial when the Kerner Commission said after the riots, and I call them rebellions, the urban rebellions, the Kerner Commission said, in effect, you know, media, you have been covering the nation only through white eyes. And fewer than 5% of the people who work for newspapers in the whole country, black people who work for white newspapers, was fewer than 5%. And I think that was an exaggeration. So one of the positive things that happened after that very public slap in the face that the Kerner Commission gave the media was that newspapers started opening up a little bit to the inclusion of women and people of color. And so I was at the Post in 1961. I left in 65 when I faced a gender challenge because I got pregnant and, you know, there was no women's movement to give you flex time to take care of your children, so I quit. And I was rehired by the Post in the early 70s, in 1972. And when I went back to the Post, it looked somewhat different because they had started bringing in bright young people. But one of the things we encountered whenever we would go to the editors and say, but we need you to hire more people of color. And they would say, but we can't find any qualified, you know. And we would say, we knew that was a lie, but we also knew that we had to take action. And there were such marvelous people at the Post at that time, like Robert Maynard, and he was a real leader. And I was with one of 8 people who, with Bob Maynard in the lead, founded the Institute for Journalism Education. And what we did was to train minority people. At this point, it was primarily African Americans. We expanded it as we went along. But we trained reporters, and we trained managers, and we trained editors. And so we've said we wanted to take it out of the lexicon of American journalism, those words, we can't find any qualified. And so that's when we worked so hard to start bringing them in. But I think as has been already stated, and I want to give my co-panelist a moment to introduce herself as well. But it was after that and after the civil rights movement just became a spur to all the other movements because Gloria Steinem, when she wrote her first article, it was called After Black Power, Woman Power. And so it's just crucial for me to remember that, you know, it was an oppressed minority in America that went on to open up the freedoms The, after that, it was the gay rights movement. After that, it was the disabled. After that, you know, it's a freedom train that just keeps on moving. And I think today is the start of another freedom train that's going to make a difference. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. And I can't say how much of an honor it is to be here with Dorothy Gilliam, one of my icons. And I've actually known Dorothy for quite a long time because we were both part of the Unity Journalists of Color movement back in the, that started in the late 80s. And when Dorothy was president of NABJ, National Association of Black Journalists, and I and Jeff actually also were part of the Asian American Journalists Association. And it's really just so wonderful to hear Congresswoman Demings and everything that you are doing to bring us back to talking about diversity in the media. And thank you to David Morgan and all of the Multicultural Media Correspondents Association folks to make this conversation possible. Dorothy and I have been at this a long time, Dorothy longer than I, but I was in high school when the urban rebellions were happening, when Star Trek began, when the Kerner Commission came out, and we in my household also had something called Asian sightings. Whenever you would see that rare occasion of somebody who was Asian on TV, even if it was as the houseboy on Bonanza, we would run out and go, "Hey, there's an Asian," and everybody would stop everything they were doing and run to the TV set to see because it was just so rare. And I did not begin thinking about becoming a journalist until well after going to college, because I did not see anybody, not only anybody who looked like me, any women, any people of color at all on the news. And that's the way it was until these changes began following the urban rebellions, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and the Kerner Commission that back then said 5%. Right now I've been part of the Women's Media Center, which every year, and if you want to see these reports, they do a report every year about women and people of color in the media and do a survey. And their survey that came out this year shows that there's 21% people of color in the media today. I mean, here we are 50 years after, and that's probably quite an undercount because they also said that the number of reporting organizations was far lower than ever. So I'm just imagining the other 80% of the media that did not report, it's because they have nothing to report, and therefore the 21% must be far less than that too. So we have not progressed a lot in 50 years, but for me personally, not ever seeing anybody who looked like me or thinking that I could ever have anything like a career in journalism, I actually did a lot of things, but among them was that I had gone to Detroit, Michigan. I really wanted to throw myself into the movements of the time, the liberation movements of the time, and I went to Detroit, and I went to work for Chrysler Corporation. And looking at me as an Asian American woman, you might think, oh, she went to work in one of the offices. No, I worked on a assembly line in a stamping plant for a couple of years before I got laid off like millions of other people in Michigan did and throughout the country because of the collapse of the manufacturing sector of America. And it was at that time, and I had gone to Detroit. Detroit at that time was, 60 to 70% African American. The rest were mostly working class European American people, a number of Arab American folks, because the auto industry, like many industries, including our own, think that if you keep a lot of different people there, they cannot possibly unite to do anything. And so I went as an Asian American woman and not knowing that there was an Asian American community then, but when I got laid off along with millions of other people, it was at that time I just was so furious that the media was not covering the lives and the suffering of the people who had lost their lifetime, jobs in what was once a good industry that paid a decent living wage. And so that's what made me say one day when I was watching television, and pardon my language, but I said, "This shit sucks," when I was watching the news. And I said, I could do better than this. And it was at that moment I thought, yes, this shit sucks so much, I could definitely do better than this. And that's what made me think it wasn't like a high bar that I set for myself. But I thought these were the stories that I wanted to tell. And it was really the African American workers I got to know, the European American workers who were no longer working, who were suffering, and none of their suffering was being reported. So that's what got me started. I began as a freelancer. I don't know how many of you are journalists or writers thinking of being, well, that's wonderful. And those of you who didn't raise your hand, everyone in this room has stories to tell that we know are not being told. And how I got started was I began as a freelancer without a internship ever, no journalism background or courses at the time. There weren't journalism programs that I knew of. And so anyway, I started when there were typewriters and no internet. And what I did was what they tell freelance writers to do, you type out query letters, which is, I would type out probably more than 200 letters to different magazines and newspapers saying, I want to write about the collapse of the auto industry, what's happening in the labor movement, and the suffering of the people, in Detroit and beyond. And as you can imagine, having had no background or a portfolio to show, most of those 200 letters got totally not answered. And the few that did get answered said, no, sorry, we don't need any freelance writers, except for one. I got one response from an editor who said, well, we liked your query letter. And I said, great, you want me to write about this? He said, no, we don't want you to write about that. we have an advertorial section coming up of a supplement about winter flowering plants in Detroit. And would you like to write about that? And by the way, we won't pay you because we don't know whether you can do this or not. And I said, oh, great, sure, I can do that. And I didn't tell them I had killed every plant that I had ever looked at till then. But that was the beginning. And it was really the desire to tell those stories. And I wrote a lot of other stories like flowering plants. But until I did actually get to write the stories about the changing labor movement, about, at the time, something that was new called acquaintance rape. I wrote about the University of Michigan and the Michigan State University and how they had different approaches to handling sexual assault on their campuses. Those stories led to demonstrations on the campuses because people felt that, the universities weren't taking something that was considered new at the time, or sexual harassment, or all of those things that back in the 80s were new words and new ideas. And so that was the beginning of, and I guess I wanted to just say a few things about the Kerner Commission too. That was a time that, even though it was about the urban rebellions, especially in the African American community, they really spoke to really people of color and women and all people who also felt an identity, a kinship, an understanding of what it meant to be treated as other, to be treated as second class. For me, I did not see a lot of Asian Americans in the media. I mean, as I said, they were only houseboys, or even children today, Asian American kids today. If you ask them, are there any Asian faces that you think of as role models? The one that they mention is Bruce Lee, and he died in the 1970s. And that's it. And that's really a sorry situation. But so for me, my role models were the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. In media, Charlene Hunter Galt. I have to say, she was, when she was on TV, I would run to the TV too. And because that said to me, you can do this, Helen. And I did set the bar pretty low when I started out, but eventually I did get to write the stories that I really cared about, which were about social justice, about people coming together. And when Dorothy and I first met around Unity, Journalists of Color, it was really a time, and I hope we get to talk about this on this panel, a time when people of color and people of conscience and women and LGBT people knew that we could come together and make something big happen and change this world. Now, we did, but we also see that there can be what some people call a backlash. I also say it's a white lash, that's happening today to reverse the things that were so hard fought. And in my time as a journalist, and I think Dorothy and I have talked about this, we've just seen more and more division, calculated division, to try to erase the history of people actually coming together to do really important things. Whether it's the Voting Rights Act, whether it's changes in the immigration laws, affirmative action, which is what led people like me to be in the media, and other people of color and women too. And so anyway, I think one of the things I'd like us to talk about is how MMCA and how other efforts to bring people together can bring back that history, so we don't think we're carving out new ground, but actually to remember that we've done this before. And the pendulum has swung back and forth over history. It does that, but that it will swing back. And by the way, we are in the majority. In states like California, people of color have been in the majority for more than about 20 years now. And there are about 10 other states and the District of Columbia that are already at that point. And we know that that genie is not going back in the bottle, no matter how hard some forces may be trying to make that happen. That is inevitable, and it's going to happen much sooner than the demographers think. And as long as we don't see how we can come together, then our forces are not going to be able to make that change that is coming. And so anyway, I guess I just want to stop there.
Both of you, please. Both of you have spoken so eloquently about the necessity of representation, of having the kind of newsrooms that look like America, and an America that is changing so dramatically, that demographically and culturally has shifted so significantly from even the 1960s, today is experiencing a continuation of, as the very name of the summit, of a crisis. Of that lack of representation. One of the things which I think people aren't fully aware of, and I'm going to ask each of you to comment on this, is the degree to which representation in the media has serious and real consequences on every other aspect of our civic lives. The Kerner Commission, in fact, included that section on the media because, again, when a tree falls in the forest and it is not heard, did it actually fall? When a story occurs in the city and it is not covered, did that person actually experience harm? Was there a killing? Was there a loss? Were there blocks on fire? And the reality is, without a media that is representational, that is inclusive, that has an integrity to the stories that are actually happening in America, what ends up happening is we become cartoonized or invisible. And Helen, one of the signal achievements of your own career actually exists outside the newsroom, in that you were a leader in the nascent Asian American movement around a case of, one could call it mistaken identity, one could call it a lot of things, but it was a seminal moment for our community's political rise, and that was the murder of Vincent Chin in Detroit. I actually had not been aware that you were, in fact, a former auto worker when, when you took leadership and became a spokesperson for that movement. But for those who are not aware, and there are unfortunately quite a lot of people who are not aware of what happened in that moment, Vincent Chin was a young Chinese-American man, son of immigrants, actually out with his friends for his bachelor party before his wedding, when he was approached by a pair of unemployed auto workers in a bar who accosted him because they mistook him for a Japanese person. And of course, it was Japanese imports that were being blamed for the loss of jobs in the auto industry. There was an altercation. Subsequently, they chased him down in a parking lot and beat him to death with baseball bats. And that moment, and more specifically, the advocacy around that moment, really charged the desire and the need for Asian Americans to feel part of the political table. Now, a lot of that was driven by the media. I mean, we spoke about this a little in our pre-conversation, but the sensationalization, the pictures of people using sledgehammers against Toyotas, right, that were constantly being shown again and again, and the lack of Asian Americans, or Asians for that matter, being called in to speak and put context around those images is part of what led to the anger, the rage, and turned sledgehammers against Toyotas into baseball bats against a Chinese-American man. Helen, if you can share a little bit more of how you kind of put yourself into the position and help to actually amplify that particular voice, that would be fantastic.
Sure. So I was in Detroit at a time of great crisis. And when I say people were in misery, we're talking about millions of people not only out of work, but had lost everything. In order to, we're talking long-term unemployment. Today, in economic terms, people say there was a structural adjustment. America no longer depended on manufacturing. It became what it is today, an information-based and service-based economy. And so all the people in the country who were dependent on manufacturing were out of work, not only them, their children, who they had looked forward to having stable jobs that would carry them through their lives. And so when people are miserable, they look forward to finding who to blame. They're angry, they're upset. And the media played an incredible role, from the halls of Congress to the corporate C-suites, to saying, well, first they said it was the workers' fault. It's your own fault that you no longer have jobs. And that didn't go over well. So the media tried another tactic, which was, it's Japan. It's Japan, and we should send over more atom bombs over there because we are now in an economic war. So basically, we see the same kind of climate as after 9/11 that whipped up all the Islamophobia that is probably more familiar to all of us today because we're still living with it. But back then, in 1982, it was anti-Japanese and anybody who looked Japanese, because, of course, we know a lot of people think all Asians are the same. And back then, it was like that. So when Vincent Chin was killed by two white auto workers, it was in that climate where every day it was like a drumbeat, like it's these people. And if you even drove a Japanese-made car, you could be shot at on the freeway. So if you had an Asian face, that was, forget it. And what made things worse was that the two auto workers who were Anglo-American received probation for beating to death somebody with a baseball bat, witnessed by more than 100 people in front of a crowded McDonald's on a night that the Detroit Tigers were playing. And so the judge said, these aren't the kind of men you send to jail. And so, well, in a city like Detroit, who do you send to jail then? And so there was quite an uproar, but there was not an Asian American voice on it. And I was that budding young journalist. So I want to say something to those of you who are journalists or thinking about it. It's not that we park our values or our beliefs or who we are at the door when we become a journalist, because we're there because And we bring value because we see things that are missed by the 90 plus other percent at the time who were journalists. And so I knew as a young journalist that all of this was being whipped up because of a climate of hate. And as a young journalist, I also knew that they were saying, well, you have to be objective. You can't take a side. Well, in fact, every one of us as human beings, if we have any humanity, has an opinion. It's what do we do with that? And in my mind, objectivity, it's not that. It's being honest and open about where we're coming from and recognizing where we're coming from. Now, we might have a different thought about that. Dorothy, don't worry about it. And anyway, for one moment, for 1 second, I thought I shouldn't get involved. I was one of the only Asian journalists there at the time. I knew what a press conference was. I knew what a press release was. And so I got involved and started writing press releases for the group because there was no advocacy organization. And so while media whipped up sorry, I'm dropping everything. But while media whipped up the the hatred and the climate of hate, it was also possible for the organizations, for the community on the ground to counter that and to say, no, this is not true. Actually, not all Asian Americans are don't speak English, or that we just arrived yesterday, and to actually do that educational part that was missing in the media, and to also show that, you know, immediately the Detroit Urban League, the Detroit area black organizations, the leaders of those groups, the major African American churches, the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Organization, many organizations just joined in, the Anti-Defamation League, to say that hate crimes have no place in America. And that was actually the beginning of the hate crimes protection ordinances that began, that now are part of federal law. But it was in Detroit, and it was because communities came together to also say that an immigrant like Vincent Chin should be protected by federal civil rights law. That was actually a question at the time. But so all of these things happened, and it was partly through the media and the activism in the media that the community took place. So media plays both roles. But and I did not lose my job as a magazine editor or a young journalist then. I had a conversation with my editors. They said, we understand why you're involved in this. You're not going to write about this for us. And in fact, you shouldn't edit anything about this topic for us. But we're not going to stop you from doing what you're doing because we understand why you are involved. And I did write about it under a pseudonym for other organizations. But so the media was very important in that. And I felt that as a journalist, I could also be involved in something happening in my community.
Dorothy, in reading some of the praise for your book, of which there's quite a lot, one of the quotes that I think really stood out was, and I don't remember which luminary said this, that you proved essentially that there was an alternative voice in the newsroom to sort of the objective, you know, sort of white male, if you will, perspective that prevails, and that there was a way to actually bring to the newsroom authenticity, transparency, and truth that didn't, that sort of enriched the process of telling stories beyond what was seen as the norm at that time. I would love to have you talk a little bit about what it was like to tell stories. You mentioned even at the practical level, not being able to take cabs because people wouldn't pick you up, you know, but also on the flip side, being welcomed into communities that other people would not be perhaps allowed to participate in. Beyond that, the actual craft of writing, the discerning of what a valid and valuable story is, these are all changed by the fact that you are an African-American woman. If you could share a little more about those experiences.
Yes. I'm thinking particularly as you speak about the time when I went back to the Washington Post in 1972 as an assistant editor in the style section. And one of the things I was so consciously aware of is the fact that most black people did not see black things. They didn't see articles about themselves in the paper. They didn't see themselves represented. They didn't see hear their ideas being put forth or even being discussed. And so one of the things I wanted to do as an editor was to try to bring as much as I could of black culture into mainstream media, because I knew what a rich and deep culture that was. And I knew that in many ways it had been lied about, it had been distorted. The only thing I would see in movies growing up would be white people. And we never saw black images in any of that. So I knew that was important. And so I went about doing it in several ways. One was to find other black reporters to bring them on as writers in the style section. And I was able to do that. And it was amazing because these writers brought so much depth of perspective. I'm thinking particularly, actually, Holly West was already there when I got there. But he was a person, Holly West was a person who had, a lot of knowledge of, about music, about jazz, about the history, about the intellectual movements that had taken place in America that white people didn't know about at all. And because so much of our history had been actually closed off from the rest of the Americans, it had been distorted, it had been lied about. It was so important to do that. And one of the things that was very positive in the experience was that we did have the space to write long stories. And we could have stories that really, really helped to educate African Americans as well as white readers and as well as other people of color about the role and about what we had, what our people had done and what that history represented. People like W.B. Du Bois and people like who had been part of the who understood what America was about more than Americans almost. People like James Baldwin and great writers like Toni Morrison. But we also were able to write about just a lot of ordinary people. And that was one of the things when I became a columnist in the 80s, that was so important to me. And sometimes the people on the Post didn't like what I was writing. They didn't like my opinions. One editor came over one day and he said, your people columns are fine, but your opinion columns, he said, whoa, so he kind of staggered in the newsroom. And the point was, I was a columnist, I had an opinion, and I was going to express it. And I was going to use that platform in a way that I thought was positive. So many other people would say, well, all you do is write about race. But I said, no, I'm not writing only about race. I'm talking about people are doing a variety of things and are having an impact in a variety of ways who are black or who are people of color. They are just not white. And so there still just existed, so much, there's such a wall, that still exists among the dominant group. And the feeling that, the way we do it is the right way and that's the only way. And so, we had to fight against a lot of things. And I think one of the things that also helped the work that we did through our training programs was the fact that the organizations that we started were also always multiracial and multi-ethnic, because we knew that it was important to have that, that we would all learn from each other. And the Institute for Journalism Education, I've mentioned Robert Maynard, but there were representatives from, there were white, there were gay, there were, I think we had Asian Americans. I mean, we understood how important and what diversity was and how important it was. And there was just so many ways that we learned from each other, because I would often be very irritated at a board meeting when people would say, well, we have to make sure we also bring in a white person who's going to be an editor and train him so he'll have enough knowledge and information that he will be willing to listen to the ideas from reporters. And I knew that was a problem, because so often when you have African Americans who come into white newspapers, they will come and pitch story ideas to a white editor, and they are told that nobody's interested in that. That's not a good story. Who cares? And this is very problematic for some people, because you have to be able to stand stand your ground and fight to get the stories in and to get the opinions in. But one way that I grew during the process was that on the board, people like Bob Maynard said, well, we have to be able to also help white people open their minds. I can't say their hearts and their spirits, but at least open their minds enough to be open to say, yes, we must have a more inclusiveness at the Washington Post. We must have more inclusiveness in these various sections of a newspaper, or in these various sections of television or whatever. So it was a way that we, just as Helen referred to the fact that we have done so much, and history doesn't always have to be totally repeated, because we can use the example of what has happened in the past as we move forward, and we can move forward more quickly. So just as I had to be able to say, all right, yes, let me be more open-minded about how we push forward. And so we ended up, personally growing, as well as pushing the cause for diversity at the same time. These were simultaneous acts and actions. And I also am concerned, I think, with the numbers dropping, the diversity numbers dropping right now in the media. And there are probably only maybe 3 or 4 newspapers in the country, for example, that are actually still hiring and still, doing long-form journalism in a powerful way, and that does include the Post, and it includes the New York Times, and there's certainly some other places, but we have had a big change in media with the obviously with the advent of social media. But I think that it's still so crucial for us to really fight for the place that we must be in order to help the country understand itself, and help the country also be willing to be educated in a different way, and also just to break down barriers. And so I think for those of you who are perhaps interested in becoming journalists or already journalists, we know that you're going to face obstacles, but it's just so important to come into the media, continuing with that spirit of fight, that spirit of making change, that spirit of saying, yes, we can, and that is the way I think we can really, move forward.
Thank you so much. So, I've been told we are running late. I wanted to continue on this line of conversation and also have some questions in, but we're going to have to wrap this up, unfortunately, for the next panel. I will say that there are 3 things that in our pre-conversation we really wanted to carry out of this in terms of the importance of diversity in newsrooms. And that is, words that have come up again in this conversation. We need to have representation. We need to have people in the right places. We need to have inclusion, which means in the broader sense, as Dorothy was just saying, we need to be in stories, in categories, on pages that are not just about us, but that include us. And then finally, we need to have integrity in how stories are told. We are the people in many cases who are double-checking, who are fact-checking, who are guiding the narratives around us. And without people in positions of power, gatekeepers, who are people of color, who are diverse, who are LGBTQ, who are women, very often those stories are mistold. And that's worse than not being told at all. So with that, thank you. Please, let's thank our amazing panelists. Oh, sorry, Helen.
I just wanted to say one thing, too, about all of us. We have to not drink the poison. All of this, I would say, for the last few decades has been aimed, talking about the strength of media, to keep us divided, to keep us suspicious of each other. 1966, when the urban rebellions were happening, was the very first time Asian Americans were identified as a model minority, in contrast to the bad minority that was raising so much trouble in the cities. And it was just so clear. If you're not sure, 1966, New York Times Sunday Magazine and U.S. News and World Report. Look it up. And it's not written by an Asian American or any person of color. But this is the poison we also have been absorbing. And it's so dominant. And so if we are going to make change, we also need to get our minds and start thinking about the difference we're really going to make, because we don't just want to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic, right? We want to make a real change, like Audre Lorde said. You can't tear down the master's house using the master's tools. What are our tools? And what is the media we are going to create? So I just wanted to say that, looking forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you. Let's thank our panelists.